as a pathway to challenging market and industrial dominance. Um, Probably from the title, that probably doesn't seem like there's a lot oriented towards the issue of family. But I wanted to try and orient the subject of our class today around the work again of Ivan Illich, as you see here in the outline. We're going to talk a little bit about what was one of the kind of fundamental drivers of Ivan Illich's intellectual journey, which was questioning the certainties of modernity or modern day certainties. There's a lot of things that, especially in the world of development, um, certain ideas, certain words, certain concepts that are not only not questioned, but are unable to be questioned because of their rootedness in our psyche, the way that we understand the world, the way that we format our own thinking around these terms. So I want to specifically look at how Ivan Illich and other sociologists and philosophers of modernity today look at how the institutionalization of needs, the idea of specialization in the job market, the idea that commodities are what provide us sustenance, and the idea that there are technological solutions for every perceived problem. I want to look at how these four areas, these four subjects, are hardly ever questioned within the modern world we live in today. We kind of assume that these are necessary, that they are a part of reality, that they are, the foundational building blocks of the society we live in today. Um, Illich, through his work, uh, thought that it was incredibly important for us to be able to take a step backwards from these certainties in order to analyze them, in order to offer a critique, in order to be critical in a sense. And he said that the majority of philosophers and educators, development workers, whoever, all of us, have lost that ability because of the certainty that it holds. It's such it has such a firm grasp on our epistemology and the way that we understand the world, the way that we see ourselves, that we're not able to critique this. And so, yeah, once Illich critiques these modern day certainties, he then looks at what preceded these certainties, right? The foundations of modernity replaced a fundamentally different type of world, which was the world that he called the vernacular realm. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the vernacular realm was, and how Illich was not a romantic in the sense that he was not about trying to return to some idyllic past that we left behind. He never said that, the ideal is to return to life as it was in the 1600s or 1500s or any other pre-modern moment. Rather, Illich was very focused on how to rescue the good that existed in pre-modern societies, and how we can go about trying to create or rediscover or recreate a vernacular realm. And we're going to outline four different ideas that are kind of connected to this broad idea of self-provisioning, the idea of providing for oneself, for one's family, for one's community, as opposed to increasing dependence on on the world in which we live, global supply chains, industrial economies, et cetera, right? And those four kind of aspects of what Illich called the vernacular realm are broadening the knowledge base, developing practical skills with convivial technologies, starting with the basics, such as providing our own food, water, and shelter, and how we can really rescue this idea of use values, right? The idea of subsistence, the idea of producing something for one's own use, and not as a commodity for exchange value. So kind of upending all of the economic ideas that guide the modern world in which we live. And lastly, I want to try and reconnect all of this to some of the questions that we had during last class, which is what is the role of the family? The kind of this basic social unit throughout history, the nucleus of people living together in a household. And Illich also in his book on gender, has a lot to say about the space for family, which he calls the domus. All right, so that's kind of the outline for class today. Let's start with the idea of certainties. This idea of certainties was very, very important to Ivan Illich and other thinkers, friends of his, such as Uwe Porksen, who was a German philosopher of contemporary of Illich, and many others, had this idea that there are certain words, that there are certain concepts that simply cannot be questioned. For example, if we take the word education, right? Or the word progress or the word development. These concepts are so plastic in the sense that they can be molded to fit any general, all sorts of different meanings, right? When we talk about progress, what is progress to an AI software developer versus a small scale farmer in Africa. Both of them might talk about the idea of progress or development, but they're very, very different ideas, right? So Ivan Illich's intellectual journey was guided by this desire to try and unmask some of the modern day certainties. He really wanted to try and get to the root of what were some of the things that we held so deeply that essentially disabled us from being able to question, from being able to respond to some of the situations we were facing, right? These modern day certainties were patterns of beliefs, of values, of ways or organizing life and society that were so entrenched in our modern day brains and in our society that they escaped any sort of critique or analysis. I think I've shared the story that when the first year that I moved to Central America, I was working with a small scale development organization, and I was sitting around a table with dozens of other. We were in a meeting. Each of us was kind of presenting what we did, as part of our development work, and it was an education based conference. And so most of the people were talking about that we worked in education, that we provided scholarships to students, that we helped support small scale schools, that we were supporting the education of rural children in underserved communities in urban areas. And then there was one person who had the ability to say, education for what? Uh, what's positive about this idea of education that you have? And it was the first, of all the people who were kind of there at this meeting, we all kind of held this idea that working for education was inevitably going to be positive. It was inevitably going to be something that contributed to a greater good. And this friend of mine who had a very questioning mind, inquisitive mind, stopped the conversation and said, instead assuming that the idea of education is going to be good, let's talk about what type of education. What are the consequences of that? What is education replacing? What other forms of knowledge are we ignoring by focusing on only one type of education? Anyways, so the idea is that education, schooling, for example, is kind of considered this modern day certainty. Most people have this entrenched idea that schooling is always going to be good. As we talked about in another class, Ivan Illich was very critical of this idea of obligatory schooling, precisely because it was a modern day certainty that disabled our imaginations from being able to understand and respect maybe other forms of knowledge, other forms of learning. It made the assumption that learning could only occur within a professional and institutionalized space, that of the school. And Illich said, no, that modern day certainty is extremely limiting because learning occurs everywhere. It's a natural tendency of the human brain, of human development. And he said, we need to escape from these certainties so that we can critique them, so that we can try to make schooling or education better. But to be able to do that, we have to escape these boundaries that we create. So the certainties of modernity that Illich really wanted to critique throughout his entire intellectual career were terms like development, progress, technology. These were considered by Illich to be plastic words. In that sense, he called them, they were so flexible that they ceased to be useful. Like an amoeba, they fit into almost any interstice of the language. In Tools for Conviviality, and another book of his, Illich wrote that language had come to reflect the monopoly of the industrial mode of production over perception and motivation. So Illich was very critical. Anytime people spoke of development as good, progress as good, technology as good, he said that language is no longer helpful. We have to transcend that language. We have to extract ourselves from this mindset that automatically assumes that these plastic words are good, and we have to question them. An historian, Illich was interested in deciphering modern certainties and discovering their historical roots. The last 20 years of his life was dedicated as an historian to see how did we come to believe so strongly in these concepts of technology, of progress, of development. Of institutional control over the provisioning of the needs for human life. On a practical level, Illich believed that these certainties prohibited us from being able to notice how any tool, institution, or modern day creation transgresses a certain threshold of usefulness and goodness and eventually becomes counterproductive, right? He talks about this idea of counterproductivity, that a certain tool, such as the school, has a place, can be helpful, but once it crosses a threshold of becoming something that limits our ability to learn, it becomes counterproductive. And so again, the whole idea of Illich's work was how do we begin to critique these certainties that have taken hold of our imaginations, of our creativity, of our mindsets, right? One of the main certainties that he was very critical of was the idea of the institutionalization of needs. Illich believed that one of the most pernicious modern day certainties was the idea that A, humans were innately needy creatures whose needs were best fulfilled by institutions, professionals, and elites. B, that modernity, with its emphasis on industrialization and consumerism, actively creates scarcity by promoting dependence on these institutions and commodities, thereby diminishing our capacity for self-reliance and for conviviality. And lastly, that this loss of personal autonomy and human agency has led most people to be incapable of imagining a life of freely provisioning what is needed for sustenance outside the parameters of institutionally and professionally provided commodities and services. That might be a bit abstract, but let's take the example of something as simple as food, right? Most people, especially the younger generations, who grow up in urban environments, if you ask, many young people today, where does food come from? Their response will be the supermarket or the refrigerator. This idea that something so essential to human sustenance and survival has most people simply assume that it is provided by an institution, by professionals. In this case, by the industrial food economy. Foodstuffs that's cultivated on these massive industrial farms that is then shipped around the world, that then is massively manufactured and processed into things that the final item does not resemble at all the food stuff where it actually was grown. But people assume that this is how something as basic as food is produced, and that the idea that human beings can work and feed themselves is idea. We read about it in children's books about the farmer on the farm, but very, very few people in urban areas believe that this is a possibility. And what Illich says is that by this institutionalization of providing for our needs, people generally, especially over generations, lose the capacity not only to do things for themselves, but to even imagine that they could provide things for themselves. A quote from one of his books is from one of his first books, Deschooling Society, says that observations of the sickening effect of programmed environments show that people in them become indolent, impotent, narcissistic, and apolitical. The political process breaks down because people cease to be able to govern themselves and they demand to be managed. This idea between managing one's own life and being governed by a series of institutions, of professionals, of bureaucracies, was widely criticized by Ivan Illich. At the same time, he said that many people simply assume as a certainty that this is how society is to be structured. Food comes from corporations. Health comes from hospitals or medical professionals. Movement, he was also a big critic of transportation, comes from cars and airplanes and other mass forms of transit. What Illich said is that this is an anomaly in terms of history, and it's not necessarily how things have always been. Another one of the maybe related to this, another modern certainty that he critiqued throughout his career was the idea of specialization of jobs, right? Um, he saw specialization in the job market as a form of radical monopoly, where professionals create needs and then control the means of satisfying them, leading to a society where individuals are increasingly reliant on experts and institutions for their basic needs and functions. In the vernacular realm, in this pre-modern world where where our needs were not provided for, where our lives were not managed, by institutions and professionals, people generally developed a wide scope and variety of practical skills. My grandfather worked as a farmer. He was also the plumber and the electrician in his village. He built his own home. He was a pastor. He liked to write poetry in his free time, right? He was not a man of one hat, At the same time, when I was, two generations later, when I was in elementary school, from fourth grade on, every year at the end of the school year, we would take, these aptitude tests where you fill out a big questionnaire and they say, this is the job that you are most suited for. And it wasn't several different things. It was, you are suited to be a journalist or to be a doctor or to be a lawyer or to be whatever it might be. But this idea of specialization, that there are certain aptitudes that each of us have, and that the best way to provide for oneself is to specialize in a certain aptitude that you might have, and then sell your labor on the job market for a salary that you can then hire other professionals to provide for your own needs. Most of us, especially younger generations, consider this to be absolutely normal. It's a modern day certainty. But what Illich asks us is to step away from that and realize that this is an historic anomaly. Never in the history of society, of human civilization, has there been such specialization where people have such limited skills, right? Most people find it close to impossible to question the idea that one goes to university to specialize in an extremely particular field in order to dedicate one's working and professional life to that field. This, of course, portends that one buys into the commodity life wherein one trades one's limited expertise for a salary to purchase the necessities of life. This is kind of something that's assumed to be normal. However, if we go back just a few generations, the exact opposite was true. People didn't specialize in one area. They might have been better at one thing than another, but most people grew their own food, built their own homes, fixed things in the home when they broke, participated in the life of a community in different social roles. Um, and there are some really interesting studies about how intelligence levels, may be starting to drop. One important study that came out in 2018 showed that IQ levels around the world seem to be dropping since 1975. And the idea was, why is this happening? And maybe on kind of a discriminatory or racist level, a lot of people say, well, it's because people with less education are having more children than people with more education. But the people who actually commissioned this study, and when they looked at the evidence, they said that that's not the case. IQ levels seem to be dropping because of environmental factors, including changes in the education system, media environment, nutrition. People are reading less and being online more. People are being told to study one thing, right? Um, from 1975 onwards, the idea of specialization in the job market. So you get really good at one thing, but your brain is not open to all of the other different opportunities for learning. And this may be, there might be a relation to a drop in IQ levels in this specialization, this focus of very specific knowledge. Um, Another, a third of the modern certainties that Illich was very interested in critiquing was the idea that modern industrial societies overemphasis on exchange value, commodities, at the expense of value. The inherent, he said that the inherent worth of something for its practical purpose or human benefit. He argued that this focus on exchange value, driven by market and consumerism, the globalization of neoliberalism and capitalism, leads to a devaluation of activities and goods that are essential for human well-being and self-reliance, such as personal creation, community participation, direct engagement with the environment. He talked about modernity as what he termed a war on subsistence. This idea that everything that we produce, in our productive lives should be produced for sale, for exchange value, right? Whether we produce, goods, a farmer produces an onion or a carrot. The idea is that you produce that to sell it to gain money in the monetary economic system that can be exchanged for something else. Or if you're not producing something physical, you're producing something intellectual. You could be a doctor producing a service, an academic producing a book, whatever it might be. But all of those things, you produce them for an exchange value as a commodity to be sold, to be profited from, and to be exchanged in the monetary market. Illich said that for the longest part of human history, that again is an anomaly. And most human societies actively tried to limit what could be exchanged or how much could be exchanged. The idea was that there was that the importance should be on use value, right? The farmer should produce first and foremost to feed him, his family, and his community, right? Sometimes through barters, through trade with neighbors and whatnot. That the doctor, should produce his knowledge to care for himself, for his family, and for his community. This idea of use value versus commodities. There's a really interesting quote from one of his books. He says, an ever growing part of our major institutions' functions is the cultivation and maintenance of three sets of illusions which turn the citizen into a client to be saved by experts. The first enslaving illusion is the idea that people are born to be consumers and that they can attain any of their goals by purchasing goods and services. This illusion is due to an educated blindness to the worth of use values in the total economy. In none of the economic models serving as national guidelines is there a variable to account for non-marketable use values any more than there is a variable for nature's perennial contribution, right? Economics, especially modern economics, only has the ability to measure that which is sold on the marketplace, right? What we produce for our own use is simply ignored, right? As is, all of the different ecosystem services that nature provides, et cetera. But what Illich is trying to say is that what we produce for our own use is incredibly valuable. I'm a small farmer, and a lot of times I know the work that goes into producing vegetables, to producing fruit, to producing dairy and eggs and meat, and grains. And a lot of, most of the time when I have the decision to sell a certain part of our harvest or to consume it, if I can consume it, if my family can consume it, if I can share it with a neighbor through, reciprocal relationships where I know that if I share with my neighbor, eventually he or she will also share something with me. If I can do that, I prove, that is what we choose to do with what we produce through our work. If we produce more than what we can use, what we can share with our neighbors, then yes, we sell it on the job market. But most people, in the jobs, in the spaces we have, most people are simply unable to question the idea of commodity dominance, that everything should be created to be sold, to be profited from, that human beings are essentially consumers instead of producing for use value. And lastly, the last kind of modern certainty that was a focus of Illich's work was the idea of techno-solutionism. And we talked about this in a past class, the mindset that for every problem, a technical solution must exist, right? And we talked about the difference between problems and predicaments and solutions versus responses. The idea that every crisis we face is a problem that requires human ingenuity. That's something that's embedded in educational systems, that's embedded in our modern day psyche. But Illich says, look, we need to question that. The fact that we are human beings living on a limited biosphere where there are very real limits that require restraint, should have us question this idea that we can simply techno, science our way out of every problem, or create technologies that will fix whatever crisis that we come up. Illich critiqued this idea of techno-solutionism, the belief that technology can solve every problem. He argued that excessive reliance on technology, especially industrial technologies, leads to social alienation, the degradation of personal autonomy, the erosion of meaningful human relationships. Illich favored rather convivial tools that empower individuals and foster self-directed learning, community engagement, rather than tools that create dependence and control. One of the things that Illich thought is that like everything, the tools, the technologies that we use can be incredibly empowering, but once they cross a certain threshold, human beings no longer use tools for autonomous ends, but rather we have to reshape our lives, adapt our lives and livelihoods to the new environment that the tools create, that the technologies impose upon us. And he said that, look, we need to discover different ways to take back our autonomy over the technological realm, right? To create convivial tools that are under human control that allow us to create responses to the predicament of being a human being living in a biosphere. And he said that this is a great quote that kind of is a good transition into how we can begin to reconstruct a world of use values, a world of vernacular living, a world of self-provisioning rather than dependence on commodities, professionals, institutions, etc. He said that people will rediscover the value of joyful sobriety in liberating austerity only if they relearn to depend on each other rather than on energy slaves. And when he talks about energy slaves, he's essentially talking about the enormous abundance of energy that we've had in the last couple hundred years due to the explosion of fossil fuels and the technologies that were fostered because of that energy abundance. So how can we move back, or not necessarily move back? I think that's a wrong term. How can we move forward into a rediscovery of self-provisioning, of a world of what he termed vernacular? Illich was not only a radical critic of these modern day certainties, but as an historian, and he was also interested in how this, modern war on subsistence disrupted functional vernacular cultures, right? He believed that every place-based culture throughout history developed a way of life, a culture that responded to the limitations of a certain place and allowed people to thrive and to survive within those limitations. He called this the vernacular, right? In his definition of vernacular, he said that we need a term. He talked about use values as an economic term. He talked about subsistence cultures. But he said that those terms don't really, subsistence is often seen in the negative lens. The idea of use values is very economics oriented. So he said we need a word that can really try to encapsulate this return to place-based, self-provisioning, functioning societies and communities outside of market dominance. And he thought that the idea of vernacular was a good word. He defined that as vernacular comes from an Indo-Germanic root that implies rootedness or abode. Vernaculum, as a Latin word, was used for whatever was homebred, homespun, homegrown, homemade, as opposed to what was obtained in formal exchange, sustenance derived from reciprocity patterns embedded in every aspect of life, as distinguished from sustenance that comes from exchange or from vertical distribution, right? Vernacular is not just about self-sufficiency, right? The person, growing their own food. It was rooted in a community, a connectedness, where not only did one produce for one's own use value, but also for reciprocal exchange with people who shared the territory. He repeatedly expressed that his purpose in extolling the virtues of the vernacular was not to advocate for a return to some idyllic, romanticized past, but rather to help us rediscover a contemporary art of living within this autonomous and vernacular realm. So, again, it's not about returning to a certain period in history or anything like that, but it's about trying to extract value, right? Another kind of modern day certainty that kind of goes back to this Hobbesian idea that, before the Enlightenment, before yeah, yeah, the Industrial Revolution, all of light was Hobbes' term was short, nasty, and brutish. So that's kind of another idea that I think very erroneous, very discriminatory, but something that has made its way into our modern certainties. That before the explosion of fossil fuel energy, before modernity allowed us to shake off the subsistence type agriculture lifestyles, that people lived horrible enslaving lives, that we all died at the age of 30, that people were, perpetually facing famine and warfare. Historically, that's simply untrue. Obviously, there were moments of famine in history, of course, um, but most small-scale vernacular cultures throughout history around the world discovered ways to live fairly well lives, fairly decent lives. That's not to say that they were perfect by any means, but they were also not nasty, short, and brutish, as Hobbes says, right? So what Illich says, we need to rediscover what was good, what was valuable, what was decent and dignified about the vernacular realm, and try to understand how we can recreate or actualize these possibilities in the modern world that we live in. And one of the ways to do that, he thought, was through broadening the knowledge base, right? Reconstructing a vernacular realm that exists outside the industrialized, globalized commodity economy will necessarily have to begin with the process of relearning the practical skills of autonomy and broad human agency, right? It's the opposite of those aptitude tests that they give you in elementary school, where they say, you're good at doing this. You're going to be a plumber. You're going to be an electrician. You're going to be a welder. You're going to be a doctor. You're going to be an academic. No, to decrease, this collective dependency on an increasingly fragile globalized economy, we must learn the arts of growing food, procuring fuel, building homes, producing energy, kind of reinventing this idea of the Renaissance man or woman, right? Someone who undertakes a broad aspect learning, right? Not focusing your learning on just one thing, not just becoming a specialist in one very, very small specific branch of a certain discipline, but to become interdisciplinary, not just in the humanities or the sciences, but also in practical matters, right? To kind of reinvent what my grandfather did. He was a poet, he was a pastor, he was a builder, he was a farmer, he was an electrician, to learn as many things. And this obviously requires challenging the modern day certainty of academic and professional specialization. Wendell Berry, the man pictured in this picture here, he's a farmer, he's a writer, he's a poet, he's one whose life has kind of been given to broadening the knowledge base. And in one of his books, he says, we must achieve the character and acquire the skills to live much poorer than we do. We must waste less. We must do more for ourselves and for each other. It is either that or continue merely to think and talk about changes that we are inviting catastrophe to make. I think that's a great quote, and obviously something to reflect on, right? The idea of acquiring skills to live much poorer than we do, right? I think in this brief explosion of modernity, by focusing our knowledge in one very specific way, a small segment of the population has been able to have an enormous amount of wealth accumulation, right? But what Barry and Illich say is that resilience in the long term is about broadening our knowledge, our skills, in order to live, you know, more autonomous, dignified lives. Another thing that's very perhaps kind of tied into this is developing practical skills with convivial technology. As I mentioned, Illich was not anti-technology or anti-progress necessarily, but he advocated for what he called convivial tools and counterfoil research. The convivial tools are those which give each person who uses them the greatest opportunity to enrich the environment with the fruits of his or her own vision. Counterfoil research, which is kind of the scientific inquiry, the engineering and the knowledge base that allows these new tools to be developed, these new convivial tools, has two major tasks: to provide guidelines for detecting the incipient stages of murderous logic in a tool, and to devise tools and tool systems that optimize the balance of life, thereby maximizing liberty for all. Right? Again, so it's not about going back to some imaginary past where we're all, driving, living like the Amish do today, using horse and buggies, whatever it might be. But how do we develop tools and research protocols and abilities that allow tools to really create the conditions for people to live self-provisioning vernacular lives? I think in the past class we talked about home biogas, which is, I think, a great example of that. It's an example of a new technology that allows people to produce energy, on their own homes, in their own homesteads, in their own communities, thus decreasing dependence on industrial scale technologies. So, fossil fuels, massive solar, nuclear power, but to kind of increase our autonomy of our own energy supply through using new technologies, but technologies that are on a correct scale that allow people to really have a sense of agency over how they're used and how they benefit people. Another area or another important way about how we move back to a vernacular realm is to focus on the basics for human survival, right? Learning to grow food, procuring water, dealing with our waste in a responsible manner, building our own shelters. All of these kind of basic elements of human survival and human well-being are important because obviously they're the foundation of human survival and well-being. They're also generally doable or achievable by individuals in small communities. Most people have the ability, even on a small scale, to grow a bit of their own food. People can compost their own waste. We can use home biogas systems, to take human waste, what we throw down the toilet essentially, and turn it into energy. These are things that all of us can do. People can build their own homes instead of depending on massive corporations and building industries. And also, by focusing on the basics, this is one of the most important ways to increase resilience given the vulnerabilities of the poly-crisis we are facing, right? This modern day certainty that food comes from supermarkets, or that food comes in packages of, boxed foods. uh, there's something very vulnerable about that stance, right? Because that depends on, six continent supply chains, on, an enormous amount of energy that has to be continued to be available. All of these different things. I think it makes much more common sense to begin to uh, encourage, especially young people, that things such as food and water and housing shouldn't be something we depend upon, from institutions and corporations and governments, but something that we seek to create, that we seek to produce together with our neighbors in a localized setting. Wendell Berry, again, in that same essay, he says, you might need a large corporation to run an airline or to manufacture cars, or maybe to create the internet, or whatever, right? To build a computer. But you don't need a large corporation or a huge government bureaucracy to raise a chicken or a hog. You don't need a large corporation to process local food or local timber and to market it locally. The idea, the basics of human survival, right? Food, water, shelter, all of these things can be done in almost in every ecosystem around the world by local communities. And how we kind of start to relocalize the basics of human survival is going to be essential for moving towards a society of self-provisioning in the vernacular realm. And then lastly, use values as a contradiction and resistance to modern certainties. Buckminster Fuller, who was a contemporary of Ivan Illich, said that you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you have to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. I'm probably not 100% in agreement with that idea, with that phrase. I think there is certainly time to fight a certain reality, right? But the idea that you can't just be against things, right? You also have to, we have to be involved in creating alternatives, right? That has to be a counterpart to any sort of resistance movement. And self-provisioning or a rediscovery of the vernacular realm is an alternative pathway of development that is focused on human autonomy, subsistence orientation focused on use value goods and services, the development of practical skills, and a strengthened local economy, right? Instead of about how globalization is unfair to small farmers, instead of complaining about the cost of fertilizers, the cost of food at the supermarket, or the cost of healthcare insurance or whatever it might be. We need to also be involved in you know growing our own food, working with our neighbors to create a strong local food economy, taking care of our own health, going back to medicinal plants, doing things that we don't have to depend on huge medical corporations and bureaucracies. Instead of complaining about the cost of housing, how do we relearn the art of building one's own home to dwell in, to bring down housing costs, have a localized response to how we do these things. So a lot of times creating a new world is about forging a new paradigm through what we do. And lastly, I want to focus on what does the family have to do with this, right? This was something we talked about a little bit in last class, and I think that a rediscovery of the vernacular realm or the working out of a contemporary art of living, which is how Ivan Illich said, will most likely coincide with the reemergence of the domus or the household. Domus is a term that I really like that appears in many of Illich's writings, and the definition of domus from the dictionary is a farmstead with its people, plants, and animals considered as a unit, right? So the idea of domus goes beyond just the family. It's not just husband, wife, children, maybe grandparents. No, it's that nuclear family together with the people who share that space, the plants and the animals that also live there, the territory, the land, and all of this is considered, a unit. Domus is obviously the root of many English words such as domicile and domestic. In Illich, in one of his historical works, he says that this idea of domus, right, and not individual people, seems to be the subject of history. Right. If you go back, especially in pre-modern history, from 1600 to 10,000 BC when civilization began, the domus was the basic social unit. The house, at once building and family, links men and women to their possessions, right? One of those of which is land, which relate them to each other. It's not the naked family, just the people, but the domus is subsistence and autarkic. It reproduces itself in offspring. Material life is created by the home, the main acting subject through its men and women, right? So obviously, if we're going to create a novel, an innovative vernacular realm, we have to kind of reimagine this idea of domus, right? A return to the vernacular realm it will also challenge another emerging modern day certainty, one that I think maybe is a certainty more relevant to the past 5 or 10 years. The idea that the family is fluid, that it's mutable, that it's variable, and that it's essentially insubstantial. it's been very perhaps maybe vogue to criticize the family, to have this idea that the family is this gendered concept, that was focused on religion, that was very discriminatory towards women, and that the only way that people can liberate themselves as individuals is by liberating themselves from the family. That's kind of one of the hallmarks of modern day discourse. And I think Illich would say that that certainty also needs to be questioned, right? If we're going to move back into a vernacular realm or move forwards into a new way of living, close to the land, close to locality, rescuing self provisioning values, reciprocity with our neighbors. This isn't going to happen by atomized, separated individuals, right? The sheer multitude of tasks that require survival in a concrete, rooted place and territory is simply not attainable by atomized individuals. This is why Illich identifies the domus as the primary subject of pre-modern history. It's not just individuals. It's not just man and women. It's not just man, women, and their children. It's man, woman, children, the wider community, the soil, the animals, the plants, the trees, the air, the water, everything that shares a space where sustenance is provided. This is the subject of history, of human history, right? As we return or are forced towards a lifestyle of self-provisioning, the reemergence of the domus, the family that's tied to a specific landscape that sustains, will also become necessary. And so I think that it's important for us to also question this modern day certainty that the family is dying, right? And think about, what really is the importance of this concept of domus as we move back towards a rooted existence, togetherness with a community, and rooted in a particular landscape.